The dawn of December 7, 1941, unfolded like any ordinary Sunday morning at Wheeler Field in Hawaii. Most aviators were still in slumber or enjoying a leisurely breakfast when the first urgent radio transmission pierced the calm at 7:48 a.m., declaring, "Air raid Pearl Harbor. This is not a drill." Second Lieutenant George Welch, having spent the previous night engaged in a game of poker, had managed to snatch only about 3 hours of sleep when the initial explosions reverberated. His thoughts were not consumed by notions of valor or future historical accounts. Instead, his immediate concern was to ascend into the sky before the Japanese forces could obliterate every single aircraft grounded on the airfield. Wheeler Field had descended into utter pandemonium. Maintenance personnel sprinted frantically between hangars, while officers bellowed contradictory commands, and the distant, ominous rumble of bombs striking Pearl Harbor's battleship row intensified with each passing second. Welch and his wingman, Kenneth Taylor, did not await official authorization. They commandeered a vehicle, driving approximately 10 miles to Haleiwa Field, where a contingent of P-40 Warhawks had been strategically dispersed for training exercises. There, they urgently instructed mechanics to arm and refuel 2 of the fighter planes. There was no pre-existing flight plan, no comprehensive tactical briefing, only raw, primal instinct and a surge of adrenaline guiding their actions. By 8:15 a.m., Welch's P-40B was thundering down the unpaved runway, screaming into the morning sky. The Japanese had meticulously orchestrated this assault with surgical precision. The initial wave alone comprised a formidable force of 183 aircraft, with Nakajima B-5N torpedo bombers and Aichi D-3A dive bombers spearheading the offensive. Intelligence assessments had confidently predicted that the Americans would be utterly incapable of launching any aircraft. Their predictions were nearly accurate. Out of almost 400 aircraft stationed across Oahu, merely a handful managed to become airborne that fateful morning. Welch was among this courageous few. As he ascended through an altitude of 2,000 feet, he discerned them. Not just 1 or 2 hostile aircraft, but an entire aerial armada, 15 Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers, returning from their bombing runs over Pearl Harbor, flying in meticulously tight V formations at an approximate altitude of 3,500 feet. They were making their way back to their formidable carriers, likely the Akagi or Kaga, brimming with confidence that their mission had been successfully accomplished. Standard fighter doctrine would have dictated that Welch ascend to 5,000 or 6,000 feet, thereby establishing an advantageous altitude, and then dive down with superior speed. The P-40's Allison engine afforded it exceptional dive performance, and energy tactics were fundamental lessons imparted to every pilot during flight school. However, Welch glanced at his fuel gauge. He had perhaps 45 minutes of combat fuel upon takeoff, and climbing would consume precious minutes. He scrutinized the bombers once more, already commencing their gradual descent toward the ocean as they organized for the lengthy return journey. It was then that he made a decision that any flight instructor at Randolph Field would deem utterly irrational. He thrust the control stick forward and plunged toward the very surface of the waves. Welch had a mere 15 seconds to comprehend the enormity of the challenge before him. 15 Japanese dive bombers, each manned by a 3-person crew and still equipped with formidable defensive machine guns. While the Aichi D-3A might have unleashed its 550-pound bomb over Pearl Harbor, it was far from defenseless. Each Val possessed 2 forward-firing 7.7 mm Type 97 machine guns and a rear-facing 7.7 mm flexible mount operated by the radio operator. In a typical engagement, this meant Welch would confront at least 15 rear gunners the instant he maneuvered into position for an attack run. The arithmetic was brutally stark. His P-40B was armed with 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns, each loaded with approximately 200 rounds. This provided him with a total of about 1,200 rounds, a figure that appears impressive until one considers the firing time. Given the M2 Browning cyclic rate of roughly 750 to 850 rounds per minute, Welch had perhaps 90 seconds of sustained trigger time before his guns would fall silent. 90 seconds to bring down 15 enemy aircraft, while simultaneously enduring their retaliatory fire. Altitude advantage was the paramount principle of aerial combat, a truth ingrained in every pilot from their inaugural day of tactical training. This concept traced its origins back to World War I, when aviators, like Oswald Bolte, formalized energy fighting into established doctrine. Height equals speed equals options. The strategy was clear: dive upon the enemy from above, harness gravity to build velocity, execute the pass, and then climb back to a superior position before the adversary could react. The P-40 was engineered precisely for this style of engagement. Its diving speed was exceptional, and in a vertical confrontation, it could overpower most Japanese aircraft. However, ascending to 6,000 feet would demand 3 to 4 minutes, with the Allison V-1710 engine operating at full power. By that time, the Japanese formation would be 5 miles closer to their carriers, and potentially shielded by the Mitsubishi A-6M0 fighters that had provided escort to Pearl Harbor. Welch had distinctly observed at least 3 Zeros strafing ground targets during his takeoff. These enemy pilots would undoubtedly respond the moment they detected an American fighter climbing into position, leaving him outnumbered 20 to 1 before he could even discharge his initial burst of fire. The Japanese, moreover, were not anticipating any resistance at this juncture. Their intelligence had confidently assured them that American fighters would be annihilated on the ground, and even if a few managed to become airborne, they would be disorganized and easily neutralized by the combat air patrol. The Val crews were likely in a state of relaxation, consulting their navigational charts, meticulously calculating fuel consumption for the arduous return journey. They maintained textbook three-plane V formations at 3,200 feet, observing strict radio silence, probably already envisioning the hot meal awaiting them aboard their carrier. Welch's audacious decision to fly at an ultra-low altitude was not merely unconventional. It transgressed every tenet he had been taught. Yet, desperation possesses a remarkable capacity for clarifying available options. He could not outplan them. He could not await reinforcements that simply did not exist. What he could achieve was to become utterly unpredictable. Please stay with us and watch the end of the video. We will be grateful for your like and subscription. Write a comment about where you are from and what you think about the video topic. The Japanese rear gunners were meticulously trained to scan the sky above and behind them, not the vast expanse of the ocean surface. If Welch could maintain an altitude below 50 feet, utilizing the Pacific swells as natural terrain cover, he might approach close enough to make his .50 caliber machine guns decisively effective before the enemy even recognized his presence. The P-40 Warhawk was not designed for such precarious wave hopping. Its liquid-cooled Allison engine featured a substantial radiator scoop positioned beneath the fuselage, and a single miscalculation at 50 feet, a momentary lapse in concentration, or an unexpected rogue ocean swell would inevitably send Welch cartwheeling into the unforgiving Pacific. However, this audacious tactic offered one monumental advantage: virtual invisibility. At this extraordinarily low altitude, the P-40's camouflage paint scheme seamlessly merged with the dark surface of the ocean, and the Japanese rear gunners, whose focus was directed at threats at their altitude or above, were simply not looking downwards. Welch slightly reduced his throttle to avoid overshooting and maintained an unwavering gaze upon the leading V formation. Ocean spray lashed against his windscreen. The altimeter fluctuated wildly between 40 and 60 feet. Every instinct screamed at him to climb, to escape the perilous proximity of the water, but he held the control stick absolutely steady. The physiological stress was immense. Flying at such a low level demanded absolute, unyielding concentration. A post-war study conducted by the Naval Air Development Center revealed that pilots flying below 100 feet for extended durations experienced heart rates exceeding 160 beats per minute and exhibited significantly diminished reaction times due to tunnel vision. Welch was operating precisely within that intensely demanding zone, his peripheral vision narrowing, his entire focus riveted on the bombers now merely 800 yards ahead. The lead bomber was flying marginally lower than the others, steadily descending toward the water as the formation prepared for the long cruise back. Welch pulled up to 70 feet, angled slightly to the right to evade the direct line of fire from the rear gunner, and patiently waited until he was 400 yards away. At that precise distance, the convergence pattern of his 6.50 caliber guns created a concentrated cone of fire approximately 6 feet in diameter. The M2 Browning discharged a 710 grain bullet at an astonishing 2,900 feet per second, possessing sufficient kinetic energy to perforate the valve's aluminum airframe and inflict catastrophic damage upon its critical systems. He squeezed the trigger. The P-40 shuddered violently as all 6 guns simultaneously erupted. Tracers arced across the intervening space in less than a second. The rear gunner on the lead valve was still scanning the sky above when the initial rounds ripped through the fuselage. The bomber's right-wing root disintegrated in a chaotic spray of fuel and metal. The aircraft inverted and smashed into the ocean at an unforgiving 180 miles per hour. There were no parachutes, no opportunity to react, only a stark white splash and scattered debris. The second bomber in the V formation perceived the tracers too late. Its pilot desperately attempted to bank left, but Welch had already adjusted his aim. Another 2-second burst followed. This time, the rounds methodically ascended the fuselage from the tail to the cockpit. The valve's canopy shattered, and the aircraft pitched forward into a precipitous dive, leaving a dark trail of black smoke. It impacted the water 3 seconds later, 2 down in less than 20 seconds. At this point, the Japanese formation erupted into utter pandemonium. Radio discipline disintegrated as pilots began shouting frantic warnings. The third bomber in the leading V executed a sharp brake to the right, its rear gunner finally spotting the P-40 skimming the waves. Welch observed the muzzle flashes as the 7.7 mm Type 97 opened fire, but the gunner was aiming at Welch's previous position, not his current trajectory. The rounds passed harmlessly overhead. Welch rolled left, maintained his wave-top altitude, and positioned himself underneath the turning bomber's belly, a critical blind spot where the rear gunner could not depress his weapon low enough to track. Another burst. The valve's engine cowling disintegrated, and coolant sprayed across the windscreen. The pilot struggled to maintain control, but the Aichi's single 1,000 horsepower Kensei engine was failing. The bomber decelerated, faltered, and then pancaked into the ocean, skipping twice before breaking apart. 3 kills in 90 seconds. 12 bombers remained. And now, every single one of them was acutely aware that an American fighter was relentlessly hunting them from below. The lone American fighter pilot, with audacious daring, initiated his assault from an unexpected vector, emerging from beneath the vast expanse of the ocean. This sudden, unprecedented tactic caused the tightly knit Japanese formation to immediately unravel and disperse. Conventionally, when confronted by aerial adversaries, bomber squadrons were rigorously trained to compact their ranks, thereby maximizing their collective defensive firepower and preserving the structural cohesion of their formation. However, this particular engagement defied all established protocols. The assailant, a pilot named Welch, was not descending from the sun-drenched heavens where his approach might be anticipated and countered. Instead, he manifested from the shimmering, mercurial surface of the Pacific, akin to a predatory marine creature erupting from the depths, delivering swift, brutal blows before vanishing once more into the undulating crests of the waves, denying their bewildered gunners any opportunity to acquire a precise target. The profound psychological shock inflicted upon the enemy crews was utterly debilitating. One of the valves, the fourth in their disintegrating formation, made a critical miscalculation in its desperate attempt to evade the relentless predator. Its pilot elected to ascend, seeking the perceived sanctuary of higher altitude. This proved to be a grievous error. As the aircraft strained upwards, peeling away from the protective embrace of the ocean surface, its airspeed plummeted precipitously from approximately 200 knots to a sluggish 160 knots. This maneuver inadvertently exposed its entire vulnerable underbelly, a vast target for Welch's formidable armaments. Seizing the fleeting opportunity, Welch deftly elevated his P-40 to an altitude of 150 feet, precisely mirroring the bomber's ascent path. He unleashed a devastating 3-second volley of gunfire directly into the wing root, a critical juncture housing the aircraft's fuel reservoirs. The structural integrity of the valve's wing instantly failed, bending sharply skyward at an acute 90-degree angle. The stricken aircraft then executed 2 violent snap rolls, before plunging uncontrollably nose first into the unforgiving waters below. There was no chance of survival for its unfortunate crew. At this juncture, a quick glance at Welch's instrumentation revealed the escalating cost of his audacious offensive. His ammunition indicator registered the expenditure of approximately 400 rounds, signifying that a substantial third of his total ordnance had already been expended. Concurrently, the needle on his fuel gauge was descending with alarming rapidity, far quicker than his pre-flight calculations might have suggested. The powerful Allison engine, operating at peak combat thrust, was voraciously consuming aviation fuel, and the relentless, high-G maneuvering at such perilous low altitudes was significantly eroding his operational range. He estimated a mere 20 minutes of engagement time remained before he would be compelled to disengage and return to base, or face the grim prospect of an emergency ditching and a swim for survival. Yet, the potent surge of adrenaline coursing through his veins effectively suppressed any logical considerations regarding prudent fuel conservation. We hope you are enjoying this detailed account of aerial combat. Please stay with us and watch the end of the video for the full story. We would be truly grateful for your like and subscription. Also, we invite you to share a comment below about where you are from and what you think about the video topic. From the second distinct V formation, 2 Japanese bombers attempted a sophisticated, synchronized turn, a tactical maneuver designed to bring both of their formidable rear gunners to bear simultaneously. This was, by all accounts, an intelligent and well-executed gambit intended to establish a lethal crossfire trajectory that would compel the audacious American fighter pilot to either disengage abruptly or brave a veritable curtain of incoming projectiles. However, Welch's tactical acumen was already a step ahead. He had shrewdly anticipated their coordinated effort. Rather than pursuing them into their turning arc, he executed a decisive, sharp reversal to the left, plummeting back to an almost unbelievably low altitude of 50 feet, effectively vanishing from their visual field. The enemy rear gunners, bewildered and disoriented, expended their precious ammunition into vacant airspace, while Welch, a mere ghost against the somber backdrop of the ocean, repositioned himself approximately 800 yards distant, utterly imperceptible against the dark, undulating water. He then re-engaged, attacking from a cunning 45-degree angle, his sights now firmly fixed on the bomber positioned on the outer edge of the turn. This particular Val pilot demonstrated commendable skill. The instant he discerned the telltale streaks of tracer fire, he abruptly cut his throttle and deployed his flaps, a desperate maneuver calculated to induce an overshoot from his pursuer. Yet, the P-40, a machine of superior design and energy retention, possessed a distinct advantage over the less agile Val. Welch expertly modulated his power, judiciously extending his attack run by an additional 2 crucial seconds, meticulously walking his lethal stream of fire from the bomber's tail section progressively forward. The Val's rudder assembly disintegrated first, followed swiftly by its elevator, and finally, the relentless barrage found its mark within the main fuselage. The crippled Val inverted, rolling onto its back, and then plunged uncontrollably, auguring into the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean. A fifth enemy aircraft had been decisively eliminated. The profound psychological disarray wrought by this unprecedented wave-hopping methodology became starkly, brutally apparent at this critical juncture. Japanese bomber crews, having undergone rigorous and extensive training, were meticulously prepared for the exigencies of high-altitude formation flying and for executing synchronized defensive maneuvers against traditional fighter assaults. Their drills had systematically conditioned them to react effectively when American interceptors descended aggressively from above or initiated flanking beam attacks from the side. However, no curriculum, no simulation, had ever prepared them for the unsettling reality of a solitary, relentless fighter pilot launching his offensive from literally below sea level. Post-war analysis of intercepted radio communications, painstakingly gathered by American intelligence listening posts, vividly corroborated the utter chaos and profound bewilderment that permeated the Japanese formations. Pilots frantically queried the whereabouts of their elusive tormentor, while their rear gunners reported with growing desperation that they simply could not visually acquire the threat. Formation leaders, their voices strained with urgency, struggled in vain to impose some semblance of order and discipline amidst the escalating panic, even as their comrades' aircraft inexplicably vanished one after another from the sky. Welch secured his 6th confirmed aerial victory by swiftly capitalizing on a vulnerable straggler, an enemy bomber that had conspicuously fallen behind the rapidly fragmenting main formation in its futile attempt to maintain cohesion. This particular Val already bore visible scars of battle, suggesting it may have sustained damage earlier from intense anti-aircraft barrages over Pearl Harbor. It was noticeably struggling, flying with its nose pitched slightly upward, a clear indication of its difficulty in sustaining altitude. Welch, employing his signature low-level approach, closed in from directly astern, maintaining his position at a perilous wave-top height. He then executed a swift, precise pull-up to 60 feet and unleashed a concise, yet lethal, burst of fire. The bomber's engine immediately seized, its propeller abruptly ceasing its rotation and windmilling to a complete stop. The stricken pilot, in a desperate bid for survival, attempted an emergency water landing. However, traveling at a speed of 180 knots, the Val impacted the unforgiving ocean surface with a jarring force akin to striking solid concrete, cartwheeling violently for an astonishing 200 yards before finally succumbing to the depths. With this latest triumph, 6 Japanese aircraft had been irrevocably destroyed, leaving 9 still airborne. The relentless engagement was taking its toll on Welch's equipment and his physical endurance. The barrels of his machine guns were now radiating intense heat from continuous firing. His ammunition reserves had dwindled to below 50% of their initial capacity, and his hands, gripped in an unyielding tension on the control stick during the prolonged, ultra-low altitude maneuvering, were beginning to cramp painfully. Yet, his resolve remained unbroken. The sheer audacity of his unconventional tactic was proving undeniably successful. The Japanese forces found themselves utterly incapable of coordinating an effective defensive response against an adversary they could neither consistently perceive nor accurately anticipate. The profound effectiveness of this wave-hopping strategy extended far beyond mere surprise. It was underpinned by fundamental principles of physics. At sea level, the atmospheric density is approximately 0.0765 pounds per cubic foot, a stark contrast to the significantly thinner air at 10,000 feet, where the density measures around 0.0565 pounds per cubic foot. This substantial 26% increase in air density at lower altitudes provided a crucial advantage. It meant that the projectiles from Welch's formidable array of 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns were traversing a denser medium, which paradoxically served to stabilize their trajectory over shorter distances. The rounds exhibited notably less ballistic drop and lateral drift in this thicker air, thereby rendering his gun convergence pattern far tighter and more dependably accurate within engagement ranges spanning 300 to 500 yards. The P-40's armament had been meticulously harmonized to converge its fire at a precise distance of 300 yards, a standard configuration designed to achieve the maximum possible concentration of firepower at that specific range. In contrast, at higher altitudes, the rarefied atmosphere and typically longer engagement distances would cause bullets to disperse more widely as they traveled, inevitably diminishing the probability of scoring a hit. However, operating at an astonishingly low altitude of 50 feet, Welch consistently engaged his targets within the optimal zone of 250 to 400 yards, precisely where all 6 streams of gunfire coalesced into a devastating, concentrated cone. With every pull of the trigger, approximately 40 rounds per second were unleashed into a target area no larger than a typical kitchen table. In stark contrast to Welch's tactical advantages, the Japanese Val bombers were plagued by an inherently disadvantageous defensive geometry. Their rear-mounted 7.7 mm Type 97 machine guns possessed severely restricted depression angles. A gunner, even with maximum effort, was physically unable to aim the weapon more than approximately 30 degrees below the aircraft's horizontal plane. When Welch executed his attacks from the precarious way-top level, his approach vector presented an upward angle of between 40 to 50 degrees from the perspective of the Val's rear gunner. To even conceivably target him, the gunner would have been compelled to lean precariously out of the aircraft's fuselage and attempt to fire almost directly downwards, a maneuver rendered mechanically impossible by the rigid constraints of the gun mount itself. Consequently, the Val's entire defensive armament, which had been specifically engineered to repel fighter attacks originating from above or at a level altitude, was rendered utterly impotent and completely neutralized by Welch's ingenious low-level strategy. Furthermore, a crucial factor in Welch's success was the dramatically altered target silhouette presented by the enemy aircraft. When an observer views an aircraft from a position above or at the same altitude, what is typically visible is the slender, narrow profile of its fuselage and wings, which collectively represent a comparatively diminutive target area. However, when Welch gazed upward at the formidable Vals from his vantage point directly below, he was afforded a panoramic view of their entire wingspan, the expansive and vulnerable underbelly of the fuselage, and the substantial surface area of the horizontal stabilizer. This unique perspective effectively amplified the target aspect by an astonishing approximate 200%. This phenomenon echoes the fundamental principle that underscored the vital importance of belly gunners on B-17 bombers during World War II. Aircraft are intrinsically most susceptible to attack from below precisely because that angle of approach exposes their largest and most vulnerable surface area. The inherent limitations of human vision also contributed significantly to Welch's overwhelming tactical advantage. Extensive research undertaken by the Army Air Force's School of Aviation Medicine in 1943 unequivocally demonstrated that pilots, when actively searching for potential aerial threats, instinctively direct their gaze along the horizon line and upwards. This ingrained behavior is deeply rooted in our evolutionary predispositions, which historically dictate that danger primarily emanates from above. Consequently, the Japanese rear gunners were profoundly affected by a cognitive phenomenon aptly termed altitude bias, leading them to incessantly scrutinize the 6 o'clock high and 3 o'clock high positions, while tragically neglecting the critical, low-lying expanse of water directly beneath them. By the time their beleaguered minds could fully process the unprecedented reality that the lethal threat was emerging from below, Welch had invariably already delivered his devastating salvo and executed a swift disengagement. Welch masterfully capitalized on yet another harsh and unforgiving reality intrinsic to low-altitude aerial combat: the absolute absence of any margin for error on the part of the defending aircraft. Had he inflicted damage upon an enemy bomber at a more conventional altitude of, say, 3,000 feet, the crew would have been afforded precious moments to thoroughly assess the extent of the damage, perhaps even attempt rudimentary in-flight repairs, or meticulously prepare for a controlled emergency ditching. However, when a combat-damaged aircraft found itself at a mere 200 feet above the ocean, its pilots were granted, at best, a fleeting 3-second window from the initial loss of control to the inevitable impact. The demise of the 7th bomber served as a chillingly perfect illustration of this brutal principle. Welch's concentrated fire scored critical hits on its port wing, instantaneously severing essential control cables. The valiant pilot made a desperate attempt to compensate using rudder and aileron inputs, but at such an unforgiving altitude and velocity, the crippled aircraft simply snapped inverted and plunged irrevocably downwards. There was no available altitude for any hope of recovery, no possibility of a second chance. The robust performance characteristics of the Allison engine at sea level further augmented Welch's decisive advantage. While the V-1710 power plant notoriously struggled at elevated altitudes in the absence of a dedicated supercharger, at the denser sea level environment, it was fully capable of generating its impressive rated output of 1,050 horsepower. This allowed the P-40 to effortlessly sustain a formidable speed of 340 miles per hour in level flight at low altitude. In stark contrast, the Japanese VALs, already operating at reduced speeds following their bombing runs and now engaged in frenetic defensive maneuvers, were likely achieving speeds of only 180 to 200 knots. This significant disparity granted Welch a commanding speed advantage of approximately 100 miles per hour, an overwhelming asset that enabled him to meticulously select his attack angles, dictate the precise engagement ranges, and disengage at will, always breaking away before the disoriented Japanese crews could possibly coordinate any effective counter-tactics. Despite the devastating losses, the 9 remaining Japanese bombers were not prepared to surrender without a tenacious struggle. Their formation leader, almost certainly a seasoned veteran possessing valuable combat experience gleaned from campaigns in China, began to implement a series of increasingly desperate evasive maneuvers. Abandoning the previous strategy of maintaining a consistent altitude and predictable flight paths, the valves initiated a chaotic sequence of random jinking movements, executing shallow S-turns, punctuated by brief, frantic climbs followed by abrupt descents, any maneuver calculated to complicate Welch's ability to achieve a stable gun solution. This adaptive strategy, to a certain extent, proved effective. Welch's subsequent 2 attack runs, while still scoring hits, did not result in immediate kills. His rounds merely stitched across a fuselage without penetrating critical systems, and another burst, though shredding a tail section, failed to bring the resilient bomber down, which stubbornly continued its flight. Welch's ammunition reserves were now reaching a critically low ebb. He had expended approximately 800 rounds, representing a significant 2/3 of his total carrying capacity. A rapid mental calculation confirmed that he possessed, at most, a mere 40 seconds of available trigger time, necessitating that every subsequent burst be delivered with absolute precision and maximum impact. Concurrently, the relentless G-forces generated by his constant, aggressive maneuvering were exacting a severe physiological toll. Each sharp turn executed at perilously low altitude subjected him to intense gravitational forces, typically ranging from 3 to 4 gs. Prolonged exposure to such sustained G-loading inevitably causes blood to pool in the lower extremities, thereby diminishing the vital flow of oxygen to the brain. Pilots commonly begin to experience the onset of tunnel vision around the 4G mark, and Welch had been enduring these strenuous loads repeatedly for nearly 8 uninterrupted minutes. His fuel gauge, a stark reminder of his dwindling resources, indicated only 20 minutes of flight time remaining. With Wheeler Field located approximately 15 miles distant, this implied he had perhaps 5 additional minutes of viable combat engagement before he would be compelled to disengage and plot a course for home, lest he risk the catastrophic consequence of flaming out over the vast and unforgiving ocean. The air combat intensified as the Japanese forces, facing mounting losses, displayed increasing desperation. 2 enemy bombers abruptly deviated from their ordered flight path, plunging towards the sea surface in an attempt to replicate Welch's own low-altitude strategy. Their aim was to become more elusive to target by flying at wave-top level. This tactical shift, while clever, overlooked a critical design limitation. The Val dive bomber was not engineered for the demanding ultra-low altitude maneuvering capabilities inherent in the P-40 Warhawk. Welch swiftly focused his attack on the first of these low-flying valves, approaching from its 4 o'clock position, a trajectory that presented the rear gunner with the most challenging firing angle. Yet, this particular gunner was either unusually courageous or remarkably proficient. He leaned precariously from the canopy and discharged his weapon, even though the gun mount was extended to the absolute limit of its traverse. Incendiary projectiles streaked by Welch's canopy, close enough for him to discern their passage. One round perforated his left wing, leaving a fist-sized aperture merely 3 feet from the cockpit. The P-40 vibrated violently, but admirably maintained its structural integrity. Welch responded with his own armament, unleashing a controlled 2-second burst. The valve's engine detonated violently, spewing a torrent of oil and metallic fragments, marking his 7th confirmed aerial victory. By this point, the entire enemy formation had disintegrated, with some bombers endeavoring to ascend, others diving sharply, a few striving to adhere to their predetermined trajectory, while the remainder scattered in various directions. This chaotic disintegration of the enemy formation was precisely the advantage Welch required: individualized adversaries rather than a unified protective formation. He discerned a Val attempting to climb back to 2,000 feet, likely hoping to achieve sufficient height to bail out should circumstances deteriorate further. Welch, in response, ascended to 400 feet, the highest he had ventured since the commencement of the engagement, intercepting the enemy aircraft in a climbing left turn. The Val pilot, observing Welch's approach, attempted a desperate, last-ditch evasive action, a split-S maneuver, rolling inverted and pulling down to reverse direction. While this is a viable evasive tactic at higher altitudes, executing it at 1,800 feet with a heavily loaded bomber amounted to a self-destructive act. The Val rolled onto its back. The pilot pulled the controls, but the aircraft simply lacked the necessary kinetic force to complete the maneuver. It stalled, aerodynamically ceasing flight while inverted, plummeted through 1,000 feet, and collided with the ocean surface in a vertical dive. Welch did not even have to fire a single round. 8 enemy aircraft were now down. 2 additional Vals executed a synchronized dash towards a mass of atmospheric vapor forming to the northeast. Welch gave chase, but his rapidly diminishing reserves of propellant necessitated a strategic choice. He could pursue these 2, jeopardizing his remaining flight capacity, or he could concentrate his efforts upon available vulnerable adversaries still within easy range. He opted for targets of opportunity. A Val, endeavoring unsuccessfully to keep pace with its comrades, became his 9th victim. A sustained 5-second volley ignited an engine fire that the crew proved unable to douse. The bomber executed a deliberate helical descent, emitting a plume of combustion byproducts until it struck the water 3 miles offshore. We hope you're staying with us and enjoying this incredible story. Please consider giving us a like and subscribing to our channel for more content like this. Also, we'd love for you to leave a comment below telling us where you're from and what you think about this gripping tale of aerial combat. By this stage, Welch's gun barrels were incandescent, their fiery glow conspicuously visible even despite the ambient daylight. The Browning M2 heavy machine gun was designed to endure approximately 150 rounds per minute of continuous fire before overheating became perilous, yet Welch had been operating his weapon significantly exceeding that threshold. Consequently, 2 of his 6 guns had already been rendered inoperable by thermal distortion, leaving him with only 4 operational armaments and perhaps 200 rounds total. His hands were devoid of sensation due to persistent oscillation, and his neck muscles were protesting intensely from constantly straining to track targets, while his fuel gauge fluctuated precariously near the quarter-hour indication. Welch then discerned 3 more Vals flying in a disorganized cluster, fleeing towards the distant perimeter. They were now at a lower altitude, perhaps 800 feet, and their pilots were straining their power plants to the maximum. He could clearly observe the exhaust emissions becoming more opaque as they advanced their throttles beyond normal cruise settings. These enemy crews were acutely aware of their pursuit, understanding that their sole chance lay in reaching the carriers before the solitary American fighter systematically eliminated them. However, Welch harbored an unwavering resolve to prevent their evasion. He skillfully maneuvered his aircraft 1,200 yards behind the trailing bomber and initiated a direct pursuit from astern. The P-40 possessed a marginal speed superiority over the Vals, but not by much. With the Vals operating at emergency power, Welch was achieving an approximate 5-mile-per-hour advantage, which implied it would require nearly 2 minutes to close to effective firing range. 2 minutes he likely lacked, given his dwindling propellant. Yet, something within Welch's psychological state had transcended logical assessment. He had just annihilated 9 enemy aircraft in less than 12 minutes, a feat that had appeared unattainable when he had initially observed the formation. He was resolute. The last enemy aircraft would not evade capture. At 600 yards, he initiated a sustained volley of gunfire, cognizant that his diminished number of operational weapons necessitated more trigger time to achieve the desired concentration of projectiles. incendiary projectiles converged upon the trailing Val. The rear gunner was firing back, but his rounds were demonstrably failing to reach their intended target. The 7.7mm Type 97 machine gun had an optimal operational distance of perhaps 500 yards, and accuracy beyond 400 was largely based on optimistic conjecture. Welch's .50 caliber weapons, by stark contrast, remained deadly beyond 1,000 yards. Rounds started striking their mark. The Val's right tailplane sustained numerous impacts, and the aircraft began a gradual rotation to the starboard. The pilot struggled desperately against the aircraft's directional apparatus, but hydraulic fluid was gushing from ruptured conduits. The bomber flipped upside down and plunged. 10 kills. The fuel warning light illuminated crimson. Welch had perhaps 8 minutes of remaining operational endurance, patently insufficient to make it back to Haleiwa, and definitely not enough to reach Wheeler Field. Nevertheless, the two remaining Vals were directly ahead, 500 yards distant, and slightly below. He advanced the power lever to full military power one last time. The Allison engine resounded powerfully, its temperature gauges rapidly ascending into the critical temperature range. Army Air Forces regulations stipulated that maximum continuous power should never exceed 5 minutes to avert mechanical degradation. Welch had been operating at or close to peak performance for almost 15 minutes. The power plant was destined for breakdown. It was merely a matter of timing. He reduced the distance to 300 yards on the second-to-last bomber. This Val's rear gunner was still persisting in his defense, still firing controlled volleys, striving to safeguard his machine and comrades. Welch returned fire. His ammunition counter for 2 more guns reached depletion. He was now down to 2 operational .50 caliber heavy machine guns and perhaps 50 rounds total. He discharged his weapons regardless. The remaining guns hammered vigorously for 3 seconds before they too went silent, devoid of ordnance. But those last rounds found their mark. The Val's port wing attachment point shattered, and the airfoil detached from the main body. The bomber executed an abrupt axial rotation and went into an irretrievable corkscrew descent. 11 down. 1 Val persisted, one bomber escaping towards the distant demarcation with a solitary P-40 Warhawk giving chase. Both aircraft were operating on dangerously minimal reserves. Welch had completely expended his ordnance. His engine temperature was exceeding perilous thresholds, and his fuel gauge indicated a mere 5 minutes at most. The sensible course of action would have been to disengage from combat, turn back, and endeavor to reach terrestrial safety before the power plant ceased operation. But Welch maintained his relentless chase. He reduced his separation to 200 yards, then 100, maintaining a precise tailing position directly behind the Val and flawless alignment. The rear gunner was firing. Welch could discern the brief bursts of light from the barrel, but the gunner's orientation was excessively acute, and the projectiles flew harmlessly below the P-40's belly. At a mere 50 yards, Welch executed an act hitherto unattempted. He maneuvered abreast of the Val, synchronizing his velocity and elevation, flying in extreme proximity, wingtip to wingtip. The Japanese pilot turned his head and looked directly at Welch across the narrow gap. What thoughts permeated that pilot's mind in that fleeting moment remains unrecorded for posterity. But what transpired next achieved mythic status. Welch gradually narrowed the distance, utilizing the P-40's wing to interfere with the aerodynamic current over the Val's wing. This is a technique known as aerodynamic interference, and in such tight proximity, the unstable atmospheric currents from one aircraft's wing can compromise the aerial stability of another. The Val immediately started oscillating erratically, its pilot struggling desperately for command. Welch maintained his alignment, his wing just 20 feet from the bombers, generating continuous atmospheric disruption. The Japanese pilot attempted to disengage, tilting to the starboard, but his maneuvering commands were excessively forceful. The Val underwent an aerodynamic loss of lift, abruptly flipped upside down, and plunged into the Pacific. Welch had just secured his 12th aerial victory without expending a single round of ordnance, but immediately thereafter his engine sputtered. Depletion of propellant. The Allison engine ceased operation, its propeller rotating idly without power. He was now 12 miles from land with an inoperative power plant, and perhaps 2,000 feet of altitude. The P-40's aerodynamic efficiency in unpowered flight was roughly 8:1, meaning he would require 1,500 feet of altitude to glide 1 mile. The calculations offered a slim margin of success, but barely. Welch adjusted the aircraft's control surfaces for optimal velocity for unpowered flight, indicating 110 miles per hour, and oriented his trajectory towards Wheeler Field. The aircraft was devoid of mechanical sound apart from atmospheric currents and the propeller rotating idly. No engine rumble, no hydraulic whine, just the unsettling stillness of a 12,000-pound unpowered aerial vehicle falling toward Earth. He could discern Wheeler in the distance, with fumes persistently ascending from hangars compromised in the Japanese attack. The runway looked deceptively diminutive from 8 miles out. His right wing was visibly leaking propellant from the bullet hole. The flight controls reacted with diminished responsiveness, presumably attributable to structural compromise he had not noticed during the intense engagement. There were also at least a dozen additional holes in the fuselage and tail section, clear evidence of the perilous proximity to which those rear gunners had come to terminating his mission irrevocably. The P-40 was maintaining structural integrity by virtue of sheer inherent durability, but landing was going to be fraught with difficulty. Without engine power, he had no hydraulic pressure for aerodynamic braking or undercarriage deployment. He would be executing a high-speed, gear-retracted, fuselage-first touchdown. At 1,000 feet and 4 miles out, Welch apprehended an error in his computations. The aerodynamic efficiency metric failed to factor in the resistance caused by structural compromise. He was descending at a rate exceeding the ideal, losing perhaps 150 feet per mile instead of 125. Wheeler Field's runway was approaching with extreme, precarious proximity. He considered abandoning the aircraft, but at 800 feet, there was insufficient height for a secure egress by parachute. He was resigned to remaining with the airplane until impact, committed to guiding his damaged fighter plane safely to the ground. Alert emergency personnel at Wheeler Field had already identified the imperiled aircraft. They could clearly discern the inert propeller and the P-40's unnaturally sharp descent angle, signaling a critical situation. Firefighting vehicles immediately began their urgent race toward the runway, their foam cannons primed and ready for deployment. At an altitude of 400 feet, Welch propelled his machine across the airfield boundary, maintaining a speed of 130 miles per hour, which was a significant 20 knots beyond the standard landing velocity. As he dropped to 200 feet, he was already passing over the runway threshold. Then, at a mere 100 feet above the tarmac, he skillfully pulled back on the control stick, a desperate maneuver to convert raw speed into crucial lift, aiming to dissipate his excessive momentum before the inevitable impact. The P-40 made a violent and unforgiving contact with the ground. The fuselage's underside brutally scraped against the concrete, emitting a harrowing sound akin to metal being ripped apart, while brilliant sparks erupted and trailed an astonishing 30 feet behind the stricken aircraft. Despite being secured by his harness, the sheer force of the collision caused Welch's head to slam forward against the gun sight. The fighter then continued its destructive slide for 800 feet, relentlessly grinding across the hard concrete surface, shedding fragments of its aluminum skin as it tore itself apart. Its tumultuous journey finally ceased a mere 200 feet from the runway's terminus, its nose deeply embedded in the earth, and its tail section dramatically pointing skyward at a precarious 30-degree incline. Welch, demonstrating remarkable resilience, quickly unstrapped himself, clambered out of the mangled cockpit, and then dropped to the ground. His legs, now rubbery, nearly gave way beneath him, a sudden and overwhelming consequence of an adrenaline crash compounded by profound physical exhaustion from the ordeal. Within mere seconds, a fire truck materialized, its crew members swiftly moving to assist him away from the wreckage, concerned about the potential for fire. Someone offered him a refreshing drink of water, while another individual immediately began inquiring about any injuries he might have sustained. Please stay with us and watch the end of the video. We will be grateful for your like and subscription. Write a comment about where you are from and what you think about the video topic. Welch turned his gaze back towards the severely damaged P-40, his mind still struggling to fully comprehend the harrowing events that had just unfolded. In those 23 minutes of intense aerial combat, he had achieved what he believed to be 12 confirmed aerial victories, though official records compiled later would ultimately credit him with only 4, primarily due to the stringent requirement for corroborating witnesses that could not always be met in the chaos. Nevertheless, those individuals who had the opportunity to review the gun camera footage and meticulously examine the numerous bullet holes riddling the Japanese aircraft understood the undeniable truth of his extraordinary accomplishments. The audacious, wave-hopping, aerial tactic that Second Lieutenant Welch spontaneously devised during that pivotal morning quickly became an indispensable case study within fighter weapons schools throughout the entirety of the war. Marine Corps aviators operating in the vast Pacific theater subsequently adopted various adaptations of this innovative approach when engaging formidable Japanese bombers over expansive stretches of ocean. The fundamental concept of strategically utilizing natural terrain, or, in this particular instance, the very surface of the sea, as a means of concealment while initiating attacks from unexpected and unpredictable angles profoundly influenced tactical doctrine for many decades thereafter. Indeed, contemporary fighter tactics still incorporate principles such as terrain masking and highly aggressive low-altitude approaches, directly attributable to the groundbreaking engagements exemplified by Welch's heroic actions. For his extraordinary courage and skill on December 7, 1941, George Welch was formally awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. Many within military circles and beyond firmly believe that his actions warranted the nation's highest honor, the Medal of Honor, but a lingering controversy surrounding whether he had received official orders to take off ultimately resulted in the presentation of the lesser, though still highly prestigious, award. Welch successfully navigated through the remainder of the war, accumulating a final tally of 16 confirmed aerial kills. Following his distinguished combat career, he transitioned into the demanding role of a test pilot and achieved the remarkable feat of being the first American to unofficially break the sound barrier in 1947, even though Chuck Yeager later received official credit for the groundbreaking achievement. Tragically, Welch's life was cut short in 1954 when an F-100 Super Sabre he was rigorously testing disintegrated during a high-speed dive. Yet, on that fateful Sunday morning high above Pearl Harbor, Second Lieutenant George Welch unequivocally demonstrated that a potent combination of tactical innovation and sheer, unadulterated audacity possessed the power to overcome seemingly impossible odds. 15 Japanese bombers had confidently departed their carriers that morning, fully anticipating an unmolested return journey, A stark 12 of them would never make it back. One lone American pilot, navigating his aircraft at wave-top level with nothing more than raw instinct and the formidable firepower of 6.50 caliber machine guns, fundamentally rewrote the established rules of air combat in a mere 23 minutes of absolute, unbridled chaos. This is far more than just a footnote in military history. It represents that pivotal moment when sheer desperation transformed into an undeniable tactical genius, and one pilot's seemingly insane decision became an enduring legend that continues to be meticulously studied by fighter pilots 80 years later.